There's a moment that happens quietly, almost invisibly, when you stop explaining yourself and her mind starts doing the work you used to do for her. Most men never realize when that moment arrives. Stay with me because near the end of this conversation, I'm going to name the psychological shift that changes everything. And once you see it, you won't unsee it. If this kind of grounded, honest psychology helps you think more clearly about your relationships, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, for your future self. Now, let's begin gently. I want you to understand something important right away. Silence is not punishment. Silence is not manipulation, and it is definitely not a tactic to control someone else's emotions. When silence is used that way, it backfires. What we're talking about today is something very different. We're talking about what happens psychologically when a man stops over explaining, stops chasing clarity at his own expense, and starts holding emotional stillness instead. Many men are taught directly or indirectly that if something feels off, they should fix it immediately. Talk it through, reassure, explain intentions, clarify tone, smooth discomfort. On the surface, that sounds mature. But when this becomes a reflex, something subtle happens. You remove the other person's need to reflect. When you go silent, not cold, not angry, not withdrawn, but grounded and emotionally contained, her mind doesn't relax, it becomes active. And the reason is simple: uncertainty activates meaning making. The human brain hates unanswered questions. When you are always available with explanations, her brain stays passive. When you're not, her brain fills the space. At first, the gap feels uncomfortable. She may tell herself you're just busy or tired or distracted. But as the silence continues, something deeper begins to surface. She starts replaying interactions, your tone, your boundaries, your consistency. And here's the part most men don't expect. She starts evaluating herself in relation to you. This is not about ego, it's about psychological contrast. When you were constantly reaching out, checking in, and clarifying, you were emotionally predictable. Predictability feels safe, but it also reduces perceived depth. When you become still, when you don't rush to reassert connection, your emotional presence becomes less readable, and the mind associates unreadability with importance. Now, let me be very clear. This only works when your silence is congruent with self-respect. If your silence is filled with resentment, fear, or the hope of getting a reaction, that energy leaks. People feel it. But when your silence comes from inner stability, from knowing who you are, what you offer, and what you will not chase, the dynamic shifts. She begins to wonder not why is he ignoring me, but what changed? And that question is powerful because it places the focus inward, not outward. Men often think attraction is built through action alone, words, gestures, effort. But some of the most profound shifts happen through absence of noise, through emotional containment, through the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs to prove his value in real time. And in that quiet, her mind starts connecting dots you never drew for her. When a man goes silent in a grounded way, something deeper than curiosity begins to unfold in her inner world. The silence doesn't just create questions, it creates contrast. And contrast is where perception changes. Before the silence, the emotional rhythm was familiar. She knew when you'd respond, how you'd respond, and what emotional position you'd take. Familiarity isn't bad, but the mind quickly categorizes what it can predict. Once categorized, it stops paying close attention. This is how emotional presence slowly becomes background. Noise, even when intentions are good, when that rhythm breaks, when you no longer rush to fill space, the mind wakes up. Her thoughts don't immediately go to panic, they go to recalibration. She starts sensing that the emotional center of gravity has shifted, and psychologically, whenever the center shifts, the mind asks one question first. Did I misjudge something? That question matters more than any text message or conversation, because now, instead of you explaining who you are, her perception begins reorganizing itself. She starts noticing things she overlooked before. Your boundaries, your emotional steadiness, the fact that you didn't collapse into reassurance or defensiveness. And slowly, A new narrative forms not because you forced it, but because you allowed space for it to emerge. This is where many men misunderstand the process and sabotage it. They panic in the silence. They feel the urge to clarify, to check in, to make sure nothing is wrong. That urge usually comes from anxiety, not care. And when acted on, it collapses the very psychological space that was doing the work for you. You see, attraction and respect don't grow in environments where everything is immediately resolved. They grow where there is room for reflection. Silence creates that room. Her mind begins asking questions that weren't available before. Why doesn't he need to chase this? Why does he seem so steady? What does he know that I don't? These aren't conscious thoughts at first. They're emotional impressions, subtle shifts in how you're felt, not how you're analyzed. And here's the crucial distinction. You are no longer performing emotional availability. You are embodying emotional security. That difference changes everything. Emotional availability says, I'm here whenever you need. Emotional security says, I am here and I am whole, whether you lean in or not. One invites dependence, the yosi, other invites respect. When your silence is rooted in security, it communicates non-neediness without a single word, and the human psyche is exquisitely sensitive to neediness, not just in others, but in itself. As her mind notices that you're not reaching for reassurance, she becomes aware of her own reaching. That awareness creates imbalance, and imbalance creates motion, not because she's losing control, but because the dynamic no longer runs on autopilot. This is where her emotional investment begins to reorganize, not dramatically, not instantly, but quietly, thought by thought, feeling by feeling. And once that process starts, words matter far less than presence ever did. There is a moment, quiet, internal, and rarely spoken aloud when her attention turns inward in a way it didn't before. This is the moment most men never see, but they feel the effects of it later. It's the moment where silence stops being about you and starts becoming about her. Up until now, the dynamic allowed her to stay emotionally comfortable. When you explained, reassured, or pursued clarity, the emotional labor stayed mostly on your side. Her role was reactive. She could lean back, evaluate, decide. But when you become still, when you don't collapse into urgency, the emotional mirror turns toward her. And mirrors are uncomfortable. She begins asking questions that aren't about your behavior, but about her own position in your life. Not in words, but in sensation. Where do I stand? How much do I actually matter here? Why does his absence feel heavier than his presence used to? This isn't insecurity, it's awareness. When someone no longer chases emotional certainty, the mind starts testing its assumptions. And one of the strongest assumptions people carry, often unconsciously, is that others will always remain emotionally available on demand. When that assumption dissolves, value becomes visible. Your silence introduces a pause. And in that pause, her emotional nervous system can no longer outsource regulation to you. She has to feel what she feels without immediate relief. That's where attachment patterns quietly surface. If she was used to being pursued, she now feels the absence of that pursuit. If she relied on your reassurance, she now notices the space where it used to be. And here's the key point most advice gets wrong. This isn't about making her anxious, it's about allowing truth to emerge without interference. When you don't rush in to manage her emotions, you're not abandoning her. You're respecting her capacity to feel and reflect. That respect registers, even if she can't articulate it yet. Men often believe that being emotionally mature means always smoothing things over. But real maturity sometimes means allowing discomfort to exist without trying to fix it prematurely. Silence, when grounded, communicates trust in both yourself and the other person. And that trust is magnetic. She starts sensing that your emotional center doesn't orbit around her reactions, that you're not pulled off balance by uncertainty. And emotionally, that reads as strength, not dominance, not coldness, but steadiness. This is where many men make a crucial mistake. They confuse steadiness with distance. They think silence means disengagement. It doesn't. Emotional presence doesn't require constant expression. In fact, presence deepens when it's no longer noisy. Your stillness gives her space to feel the weight of connection without distraction, to notice what's missing, to recognize what mattered, and whether she leans in or not isn't something you control. But what you do control is whether you abandon your own center, trying to secure an outcome. When you remain grounded, when your silence is calm and self-contained, something profound happens. You stop negotiating your worth through explanation. You allow it to be experienced instead. And that experience, felt rather than argued, is what quietly reshapes how you're held in her mind. At this stage, something subtle but decisive begins to form. It's not drama, it's not confrontation, it's a quiet reordering of emotional weight. And this is where many men misunderstand what's actually happening. When you remain silent without withdrawing your integrity, her nervous system starts recalibrating to a new baseline. Before, the connection may have been driven by momentum, messages, reactions, emotional exchanges. Now, momentum is gone. What remains is signal, and signal is harder to ignore. She starts noticing how she feels when she thinks about you, not when you're actively engaging her. That distinction matters because emotions that only exist in interaction are shallow. Emotions that persist in absence are rooted. This is where your silence does its deepest work. Her mind begins linking your emotional steadiness with safety. Not excitement, not intensity, safety. The kind that doesn't need constant reassurance, and psychologically safety paired with uncertainty creates intrigue. It says this person isn't unstable, but I also don't fully have access to him. That combination activates respect. Now, let's be very clear. Respect doesn't come from being hard to reach. It comes from being whole. Your silence is simply the absence of overfunctioning. You are no longer carrying the emotional rhythm for both of you. And when that happens, the imbalance becomes visible. She may feel the urge to reach out or to test or to re-engage in small ways, not because she's confused, but because the dynamic no longer feels one-sided. And here's the critical part. What you do next matters far less than how you are. If you respond from calm presence rather than urgency, the new emotional pattern stabilizes. If you respond from fear of losing her, the old pattern snaps back. This is where many men unknowingly undo their progress. They interpret her renewed attention as a green light to resume overgiving, but what actually sustained her interest was not the attention. It was the shift in your emotional posture. Silence revealed something you didn't announce, that your sense of self is not dependent on constant validation, and that realization changes how you're felt. She begins to associate you with emotional grounding rather than emotional effort, with depth rather than availability, and depth is what the mind returns to when it's no longer distracted by noise. This isn't about winning someone back. It's about no longer losing yourself. When you stop filling every gap, you stop competing with her inner world, you allow her to meet herself in the space you left behind, and whatever she discovers there, longing, clarity, indifference, is information, not a verdict. Your role is not to force an outcome. Your role is to remain aligned, and alignment has a quiet gravity. Now we arrive at the part most men never hear explained clearly, even though they feel it in their bodies. This is where silence stops being a behavior and becomes an identity shift. Up to this point, your silence has changed the dynamic between you and her, but at a deeper level, something else has been happening. Your relationship with yourself has been changing too. And that's what her mind is actually responding to. When a man no longer needs to explain his value, he stops leaking it. Think about that for a moment. Every time you over-justify, over-clarify, or over-pursue, there's an unconscious message underneath it. I need you to understand me so I can feel secure. When that need disappears, the message reverses. It becomes, I am secure whether you understand me or not. That shift is felt instantly, even if it's never spoken. Her mind begins to register you as someone who is Internally referenced, not externally regulated. Someone whose emotional center is self sustained. And psychologically, people orient toward what feels stable under pressure. This is why your silence feels heavier now than your words ever did. Because silence backed by self respect carries coherence, it has weight, it signals that your life, your values, and your emotional well being are not on hold, waiting for a response. And that creates a quiet but undeniable contrast with the version of you that was always emotionally available on demand. She starts sensing that connection with you is a choice, not a guarantee. Not because you threaten to leave, but because you no longer behave as if staying requires self abandonment. And this is where many men misunderstand the result. The goal is not to make her chase. Chasing is unstable. The goal is to be chosen freely. And people choose what they respect. Your silence removes pressure. It removes emotional bargaining. It removes the sense that the relationship needs constant maintenance to survive. And in that absence of pressure, authentic desire either emerges or it doesn't. Both outcomes are valuable because now you're no longer negotiating from fear, you're responding from clarity. If she leans in, it's because she feels drawn, not obligated. If she doesn't, it's because the connection was dependent on imbalance. Either way, you win something far more important than attention: self-rust. This is what most men miss. Silence isn't powerful because of what it does to her. It's powerful because of what it restores in you. You stop contorting yourself to be understood. You stop explaining feelings that should be felt. You stop carrying the emotional weight of two people. And when you do that, your presence changes, even when you say nothing at all. Section 6. This is where everything settles into clarity, not as a revelation, but as a quiet truth you feel rather than analyze. When you go silent in the way we've been talking about, you're not stepping away from connection. You're stepping into alignment. And alignment has a consequence many men don't anticipate. It removes illusion. Illusion is the belief that if you just say the right thing, explain enough, or try a little harder, the outcome will stabilize. Silence dissolves that belief. It shows you what remains when effort is no longer propping the dynamic up. And that's the real gift. Like, if she leans toward you now, it's because something genuine was already there. Something that didn't need constant reinforcement. If she drifts away, it's not because you failed. It's because the connection depended on you overextending yourself to keep it alive. That distinction changes how loss feels. It no longer feels like rejection, it feels like information. And emotionally intelligent men know how to work with information instead of fighting it. Here's what most people won't say out loud. The moment you stop trying to manage how you're perceived is the moment you become most accurately perceived. Your silence allows her to experience you without distortion. No persuasion, no performance, just presence or absence. And presence, when it's real, speaks loudly. At this point, her mind may have filled the gaps in many ways, some flattering, some uncomfortable, some clarifying, but the outcome is no longer something you need to chase because you're no longer asking, how do I keep this? You're asking, does this meet me where I am? That question marks the transition from emotional dependence to emotional adulthood. You don't become colder, you become clearer. You don't withdraw love, you withdraw self-betrayal, and that's why silence, when it's grounded, feels so different from neglect. Neglect feels empty. Grounded silence feels full of self-respect, full of containment, full of an inner life that doesn't collapse when someone else pauses. This is the part I wanted you to hear most carefully. The power was never in her reaction. It was in your return to yourself. When you stop filling every gap, you give life the chance to meet you honestly. And honesty, while quieter than reassurance, is infinitely more stable. So if you take anything from this, let it be this. You don't need to disappear to matter. You don't need to explain yourself to be valued. And you don't need to speak constantly to be felt. Sometimes the strongest signal you can send to her and to yourself is that you trust your own center enough to be still. And from that stillness, Whatever unfolds next will be real. When you go silent, not out of anger, not to punish, but because you stop over explaining, something interesting happens. Her mind doesn't relax, it starts working. You see, when you were always available with reassurance, clarity, and emotional effort, her brain didn't need to reflect. But silence creates space, and space forces meaning. She begins replaying moments, questioning assumptions, and feeling the weight of your absence more than the comfort of your presence ever created. This isn't about manipulation, it's about self-respect. When you stop chasing emotional certainty, you signal something powerful without saying a word. You are grounded within yourself, and grounded men don't beg to be understood. They're felt. Her attention turns inward. Not why is he quiet, but why does this feel different? That question changes the dynamic because now you're no longer proving value. You're allowing it to be experienced. Silence doesn't make you disappear. It reveals what was real all along. And the truth is simple. When you stop filling every gap, you find out who was actually willing to meet you there. That clarity is the real